I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. In April 1974, one of the most famous authors of our time published his first novel. And half a century after Stephen King's Carrie hit bookshelves, he is still publishing more or less a book a year. This May, we'll see his latest, a collection of short fiction titled You Like It Darker, which will be somewhere in the vicinity of his 80th book, if you count novels, short story collections, books written under his pseudonym Richard Bachman, and works of nonfiction. When I first appeared on this podcast as a guest years ago, I talked about how Stephen King was one of the gateway drugs for me as a reader. I think I picked up It, one of his longest books, the one about, Pennywise the Clown, when I was 10 years or so. Should I have been reading It at the age of 10? Almost certainly not. But are there some of you listeners who also read King at an inappropriately early age? Almost certainly. This is not an uncommon story. Since then, I've read every one of his books at least twice, and some of them more than that. When I think of all the books I could have been reading instead, I have yet to read The Custom of the Country, for God's sakes. When I think of all the books I could have been reading instead, I say to myself, no regrets. I have absolutely no regrets, because almost all of King's books, even the bad ones, have brought pleasure to me in some way, and pleasure is just something that's not to be underestimated when it comes to reading. It's not the only thing, of course, but it's a pretty big one. Later on in the show, we'll have a check-in with TV showrunner Damon Lindelof, one of the people behind shows like Lost and The Leftovers and Watchmen, about the influence of King on his work. But first, I'm joined by an author who, like me, has read and reread many of King's books. Grady Hendrix is the author of novels such as My Best Friend's Exorcism, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, and most recently, How to Sell a Haunted House. More than a decade ago, for the blog of the Publishing House Tour, he launched a project called The Great Stephen King Reread, an effort that eventually stretched out to a series of essays on several dozen books. He knows horror well, he knows the work of Stephen King well, and it's a pleasure to have him on. Grady, welcome to the Book Review Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk a little King.
So am I. Now, Grady, as part of your King reread, which ended in 2017, you write that you read 38 novels, 15 novellas, 111 short stories, and 5 poems. And this is leaving out books he wrote with other people, books written under his pseudonym Richard Bachman, his Dark Tower books. We'll get to some of those books eventually. But first, origin story required. Tell me how and when you started with this author that the two of us have come to know so well.
Well, I came to King probably the way a lot of people do, which is when you're about 13, 14 years old, 12. That's the age, right? That's the best age to encounter him, I think, for the first time. And I read a lot of what he did, not really as it came out, but as I could get a hold of it, mostly from used bookstores. And then, like a lot of people in my generation, there came a book known as the Tommyknockers, and I was just upset and disappointed and sad. Opinion I've revised completely since then. I was a reckless and callow youth. And I sort of stopped keeping up with King. And years later, I was like, well, I haven't read anything by him in a while. And picked him back up. And man, he's still an institution and a half.
Now, you are now a writer of horror novels, but when you started this project, you were more of a journalist, would you say?
Yeah, I did cultural coverage kind of stuff, freelance, back when you could make a living doing that. But when I did the reread for Tor, I was freelancing and not making much money at all. And Tor, I think they paid $25 a pop. So I was like, oh, I do 4 of these in a month. That's grocery money. And I was pretty stony broke at the time. And so I started the reread. I was always trying to pitch them things to do. And they're like, yeah, sure, do the first 10. And it grew, metastasized like some kind of fungus from outer space.
Some of those books are pretty long for $25.
Yeah, it's true. But there was also a side benefit to this, because when I started doing it, I hadn't signed my first book was Horror Store about a haunted IKEA. And I hadn't even signed a contract for that. That was not even a gleam in anyone's eye. By the time I was finished, 5 years later, where I got to in the reread, I had won a Stoker Award for this book. I did Paperbacks from Hell. I had a couple of novels under my belt. And so my life changed tremendously in those 5 years. And the one really consistent thing was reading these big, long books by Stephen King. And I developed sort of, a little spirit animal, Stephen King, that kind of sat on my shoulder. And I almost have no interest in ever meeting the original guy because the original article, because I've got a tiny Stephen King that lives in my head that's a good friend.
If you've read the book, his book on writing, which is part memoir and part sort of writing manual, he recounts this story that has been told so many times. He was a high school teacher living in a trailer in Maine with his wife and 2 kids. He wrote the first few pages of this book. He thought it wasn't very good. He threw it out only to have his wife Tabitha fish them out of the trash, tell him to keep writing, and his entire career spools out from there. Now, Grady, in your essay on the book as part of your reread project, you write, King's priority isn't plot, it's character. This focus is what differentiates him from a lot of genre writers.
Stephen King is one of the few, so many of his books are named after his characters. You've got Carrie, Dolores Claiborne, it goes on, Lisey's story, Cujo. And so character is the primary thing for him, and he just follows where those characters go. And often they seem to take on life and kind of evolve as the book is written. If you read something like The Stand, those characters are really, when you start that book, those characters are some thin gruel. They are you've got a salt-of-the-earth working guy, and you've got a pregnant teenager, who's a good girl, and you've got a mean, lecherous kid. But over the course of the book, it's like King is sort of discovering more about them. They become really complicated, interesting people, but it leads to him to write some pretty long books because he goes where the characters go. Carrie is really interesting because he was really inspired. King was really inspired by these books by John Ferris called Harrison High novels. The Girl from Harrison High. They were very, very similar to Carrie in the sense of they're these almost core samples of high school life. And King tried to write an early book of his that will never see the light of day called Sword in the Darkness, which is set at a high school. And it's about some kids who start a race riot to create the cover for a gang that's going to rob a bunch of loan sharks and pawn shops, I think. And from everyone I've talked to who's read this book or seen a draft or have seen bits of it, it is plotty. There's going to be a militant speaker coming to town, and they're going to start a race riot, and then they're going to use it to rob stores, and there's a love triangle and all this. Carrie, it's about one woman, just a girl having her first period. It could not be more personal and character-driven, and I think that really sets him apart from not only his earlier attempts at fiction in a novel, and probably to me is the reason this one came together and the others never seemed to quite gel, but also from a lot of genre writers. What's the next exciting cliffhanger? One of the things that kills me and is one of the reasons I'm such an inefficient and poor writer is I'll write a book and I'll have all these ideas for, this is going to happen, and this great scene and this cool set piece. And I try to jam them all in. And ultimately, it takes me a long time to take them all out because what readers want is to follow a character through a story and see how they react. And that is essentially between Carrie and the narrator. It's just their lives over the course of a couple of weeks.
I think I saw an interview once where King was referring to John Irving, who was a contemporary of his, and he talked about how John Irving is said to have said that he either knows what the last page of his book is always going to be, or he writes the last page of the book for something to that end. And King has said, I have no idea when I start where this book is going to go. I think it was a Paris Review interview. He talked about excavating the story from the ground, and that is how he discovers it as opposed to an outline on a wall.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating because I don't think King knows how it works. His life for the past 50 years has been writing a book. And that really becomes an important process if you're a writer. The actual engagement in writing the book, it really shapes your life. And that's what he does nonstop. And you can read on writing and learn about closing the door of your writing room or how many words you should write a day or don't use adverbs, all these things King says about the mechanics. But that basic thing he engages in, that imaginative act, he does not talk about very often. Like you said, he excavates the fossil. What fossil? Where? Where's he digging? What's he using to dig with? It's a process he's described as dreaming, conscious dreaming. And that's wild, that for so much of his adult life, he basically has been putting himself into a trance.
So, Grady, it's the case with many long-running authors or artists, really, that you can often break their careers into very distinct periods, right? And I feel like with King, you have the blazing early years when he was on the come-up, and you have books like The Shining and The Stand. You have his years of primacy in the 80s when he was just a publishing machine. It's hard to overstate how powerful he was in the 80s. There are the years after he went sober. He drank a lot, used a lot of drugs. He went sober, started going to AA. He switched publishers. There's that period. And then there are the years after he got hit by a truck and he almost died. And in each of those periods, arguably, you see thematic shifts, thematic focuses shift. I'm wondering if you have a particularly favorite King era or how you see the arc of his career over that stretch.
I'm going to be one of those annoying people who says, I like them all.
You like them all.
There's something to be said and found in all of them. And in going back to reread King, one thing that shocked me is so many books that I had loved when I was younger, I really didn't love anymore. And so many books I'd been dismissive of when I was younger really just rock my world at this point. I think a lot of people, there's a myth people have that, oh, King hasn't been the same since those first 10 books, or King hasn't been the same since he got hit by the van, or whatever reason. I don't know. I think a book like Revival or 11/22/63 or Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon or these late career, very recent in terms books, I'd stack any of them up against Carrie, The Shining, The Stand, any of those early ones. It's so rare to have a writer. I mean, maybe Joyce Carol Oates, but it is so rare to have a writer as prolific as King for as long a period of time as King, who is not interested in becoming a franchise. If he starts excavating that fossil, you were saying, and it turns out to be a book about a girl who's lost in the woods, okay. If he unearths it and it's a book about a car stuck in a garage, okay. If he unearths it and it's a book about a rabid dog, okay. He goes where it goes. And it's pretty astounding, the rate of production, the long career, the decades of publishing he's lived through. I mean, starting out with the horror paperback boom, I mean, he was a prime mover.
It's interesting that you talk about those early paperback years when he was just coming up. There was a point, and you probably know this, when his editor at the time, following Carrie, King, so the story goes, presented him with 2 manuscripts. One was a book about a high school student who takes over a class. Was that?
I think it was Road Work.
Okay, it was Road Work.
I think
You're
it was
right.
Road Work.
Yeah. Sorry, it was one of the Bachman books. It was a story about a man who's about to lose his house because a highway is going to be built through it. And it was, I wouldn't call it literary, but it was it was a sort of dramatic, non-supernatural tale. And the other manuscript was a book about vampires. And his editor said, you better think this through, because if we publish this vampire book, you are going to get typed.
Right. And I think he was pretty happy to be typed. You know, he's talked about that extensively. It's interesting because one of the things with taking on that idea of I'm a horror writer is King didn't talk down to the genre. And he also felt no need to comb his hair. He really embraced horror in warts and all. And so you have someone like William Peter Blatty or Ira Levin with Rosemary's Baby or Thomas Tryon with The Other and Harvest Home, who really wanted to write respectable horror. I mean, it was about women having Satan's baby.
It's like what we'd call in movies now elevated horror.
Exactly. King was writing about blue-collar people who lived in mobile homes and teenagers popping their zits and picking their noses and cussing and having sex. And his books were really rowdy and not about, well, quote unquote, respectable people. I mean, look at Carrie. The first thing that happens, the girl has her period. You didn't see that in a lot of fiction at the time. You have a religious zealot for her mother. She is this almost mute character because she's so terrified of being bullied and so ashamed of herself. And you have the cheerleader, the juvenile delinquent boyfriend. You have all these types that you just were not seeing in a lot of fiction, which was about adults wrestling with issues of faith and religion and all this stuff. They were still good books. But the other thing that King did is he took horror seriously. He did not speak down to it. He didn't think it was an excuse to take shortcuts, or he wanted to really write what he saw in the world around him and just have it be more interesting by having vampires in it.
Now, I have to ask you a question right now, which when I ask it is annoying even to me. And it's seemingly counterintuitive. But when you look at sort of the dozens and dozens of books that he has written, you might wonder, is he actually a horror writer?
Well, think about it. 2 of the most famous movies made from King's work are The Shawshank Redemption and Stand By Me. neither of which are considered horror movies.
He's written crime books, he's written sci-fi books, fantasy books, and at a certain point, when does he cross over into being something that is not solely a horror writer?
That's one of the funny things about horror, and I don't mean to shock anyone, but this sensitive listeners may want to turn away. But horror is what the marketing department say horror is.
Right.
They want to put thriller on the side of your book. Your book's a thriller. They want to put horror on the side of it. It's going to be horror. I've been told by a publisher, we hired you to write horror, not thrillers. And okay, I don't really tell the difference. But there is a current of horror that runs through King. I think even his books that are very much, I'd be hard-pressed to say something like Dolores Claiborne is a horror novel, or Gerald's Game, much more than Dolores Claiborne, is a horror novel. Dolores Claiborne, Jesus, is it horror?
Yeah. This is a book in which the entire book is a monologue from a woman up on an island in Maine who's been accused of murdering her employer.
Yeah, and it's literally this woman talking about life. And violence happens, but far less than would happen in, say, a Dennis Lehane novel or something. So there's this dark current, though, that runs through King, and I think it really informs his worldview. And I think there's this idea that in America, that there is civilization and there is wilderness. There is the bright lights of the big cities and there is the darkness of the woods. And the whole American project early on was the woods are horrible and full of demons and devils, and we must chop them all down and kill everyone we find and make them Christian places that are good. And King's idea, which I find a horrific one, is there are things out there that are bad. They will come at you. They will happen to you with no rhyme or reason. Look at Cujo, right? That's his book about fate. Cujo's a good dog. He just gets bitten by a bat. It's not anyone's fault, but he gets rabies. It just happens. And because of that, bad things happen. These things happen randomly. They don't happen with any pattern. They happen to good people and bad people alike. And sometimes they are even older and more powerful. You never understand quite what the darkness and evil at the heart of Pet Sematary say is, but it is in there. It is in the ground. And King's horrific viewpoint, that's hardly a new idea. King's horrific viewpoint is everything else is imaginary. Our families are imaginary. Our feelings are imaginary. Civilization is imaginary. Everything is imaginary and fragile. And it's just this temporary thing that we've decided to believe in as we're surrounded and beset completely at random by these older, destructive, primal forces. And that is an idea that informs every book of his.
Grady, some of King's most famous books are very famous, and that's in part because of the books themselves, but also in part because of their many film adaptations, right?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking naturally of The Shining. I'm thinking of Carrie, of course. It, Misery, The Stand, Shawshank Redemption. I'm curious, before we start to talk in depth about individual books, how you think King and the movies have really interacted. Because arguably, the movies made King. Carrie, if Brian De Palma's Carrie hadn't been such a hit, then maybe he wouldn't be who he is right now.
Arguably. King, listen, it's luck, but it's also skill. But King would not have had the career he had if he wasn't a book-a-year writer who had a director turn out a big hit, Carrie, followed up almost immediately by a movie like The Shining, which even though it didn't set the box office on fire, it had one of the biggest movie stars in America and one of what was considered the greatest directors in the world doing it. It was huge. And so those coming back to back, and those are movies that have entered the canon, become part of the cultural landscape. Here's Johnny, The Overlook Hotel, a girl on prom night drenched in blood. These are images that reside on The Simpsons as much as they do in movies. So King really lucked out with that 1-2 punch. And the fact is, people could go see Carrie, and he had a new book out in paperback, and another one had just come out in hardback. So he really, and is that a couple of years later, then you got The Shining. So it was huge. We should all be so lucky.
Grady, I think it's time to dig into some specific books. We have 3 books in particular that you want to talk about. When we were emailing, you say you want to talk about these 3. But before then, are there any that really you just want to stump for? You want to say, hey, people, hey, listeners, read these.
Cujo. 100% Cujo.
Okay. So give us the plot and then tell us why.
Cujo is the book that everyone remembers 2 things about. One, it's about a dog trapping a mother and her child in a car. The dog has rabies. It's a big St. Bernard. It's very scary. And the mom and child are trapped in the car. 2, Stephen King has said multiple times that he was very drunk at that point in his life. He's a big alcoholic at that point in his life and drank like 3 gallons of beer a day, which is hats off. But that he says he doesn't remember writing Cujo. So no one knows this book if those are the 2 things they know about it. For one thing, Cujo is not about a dog and a woman and a kid in the car. That's the movie. Cujo is about 3 plot lines that are each one gets just as much space as the other. Yes, a woman's trapped in a car and there's a rabid dog outside. There is also another plot line that's actually a bit more compelling about the owner of the dog's wife and his son. And he's this horrible guy who owns this rec yard. He has this dog. And the wife takes the son off to try to get him to see another view of life, to go visit her middle-class brother and have her son see them because her husband's a big racist. He's abusive. He's just horrible. She has a little money, wants her kid, and she worries it's too late. Maybe all this horrible stuff from his father has already infected this 10-year-old kid, or maybe he has a chance to have a better life. And then the other plot line is the husband of the woman who's trapped in the car, whose advertising agency is in trouble because there's been one of their clients had a red dye that makes everyone's bowel movements turn bright red. It's a big disaster. Their client's going to leave them and they need to save their advertising agency. The stuff with the dog and the boy in the car is a third of this book. There are just as many, I've counted, there are just as many pages devoted to these other 2 plot lines, and they're equally compelling because this book is just, and none of these plot lines overlap. None of these characters are ever in the same room together practically. It is a book about fate and destiny and how random events just happen to people. And Cujo's a good dog, but he got bitten by a bat and got rabies. This kid, he could have a better life, but he just has the bad luck to have been born into a family with a crummy dad that his mom can't figure out a way to leave. This advertising agency might go under, or maybe there'll be some internal corporate politics and they might stay, and it's fascinating. And it's also King's probably, I think at that point, most accomplished book in terms of pure writing technique. This guy, he couldn't write a bad sentence to save his life at that point in his career. He writes an amazing book, just on a sentence-by-sentence level, and also just in concept and execution. It's so good and not what people think it is. Also, this whole thing about he was too drunk to remember writing it, I don't know. King says a lot of things in interviews that make great copy, but I'm not sure they're necessarily true. He's talked in many interviews given around the time he wrote Cujo that he does not drink during the day, and that's when he writes new work is during the day. Now, he drinks at night when he's revising stuff. Also, it would be really difficult to write a book this good when you're blackout drunk. Maybe, I don't know. But he had to write the draft of this book and do 2 other drafts of it and run through it with an editor, all so drunk he doesn't remember any of it? Maybe. I don't know. I'm not the guy. I'm not going to call him a liar, but people should think twice before dismissing Cujo.
I think the thing that is true, whether you're Stephen King or any other author or any other artist, is that sometimes you say things that are not true in interviews, or you exaggerate, or you have an interpretation of a book that doesn't necessarily mean it is the only interpretation of the book.
Exactly. And people really, they cite this quote a lot that King gave. And I got to say, just like we don't consider Edgar Allan Poe's stories simply byproducts or side effects of his alcoholism, just like we don't consider, Kurt Vonnegut's writing just a byproduct of his struggles with depression, just King's books are not some kind of byproduct of his alcoholism. He was an alcoholic and he was also an author. And those 2 things can exist and occupy the same space and not necessarily infect one another greatly. And I don't think they did. And I think it lets people dismiss his work, which is unfair.
So speaking of books that assert that there really is no point to anything and that maybe that stories really have no meaning, you and I are both fans of a book called From a Buick 8.
Yes.
Which is a book that came out in the early 2000s?
Yeah, I think early 2000s.
He wrote it before getting hit by a car.
Yeah, I think so. I think he wrote the first draft before and then,
and released it after. It's a book that did not sell very well. It's not one that a lot of people talk about. I've read it multiple times. I think it's fantastic, even though not much happens in the book, which may be why people don't necessarily like it. But I know you are a fan as well. Please speak on this book.
So I hated this book the first time I read it. I read it doing the reread, and it was like coming out of a lush forest into a stretch of desert. Every line was a battle. And then I read it again because someone told me it was their favorite book. And I had 2 choices. This person was either an idiot or I hadn't seen something in this book. I went back and it did blow me away. King had been hit by the van in the process of writing this book. And you feel like at this point in his career, he writes Cell, he writes, which is very much his reaction to 9/11 and the Bush administration and all that, and the rush to the war in Iraq. You look at The Colorado Kid, which is a book in which, like, basically it's all about a mystery. And at the end, the solution to the mystery is nobody knows. And you look at From a Buick 8, cops pull a car over. Weird, no driver. Okay. Put it in their storage unit. Sometimes aliens come out of the trunk, but for years, sometimes they don't. One of the cops dies. His kid joins the department. Hears the stories about the car, gets fascinated by them. The end. And the book has no faith in storytelling. I mean, it is a book about, I was talking about these random things that happen that King sort of obsessed about. It's a book that really feels like this is a book about how random things are, and that there is no plot. There is no drama. There is no building action. There is not a 3-act structure to life. And at one point, one of the older cops who's telling this kid about his dad and these stories about the car, because his dad was obsessed with the car too, he's furious at this kid for being obsessed with the car. What about everyone who's lived and died, who's come through this police station, the birthdays, the births, the people's hands we've held while they've died, all these things that make up a life. And all you care about is this damn car with aliens coming out of the trunk that doesn't seem to mean anything that we can understand. But the kid's obsessed with the car. And I feel like sometimes that's how I feel when I read a King book. I'm like, I get obsessed with, like, why are they coming out of the car? What is the mystery? Are we going to solve the mystery? And I think King is very much more concerned with the life going on around it. In his book on writing, he writes this really beautiful passage about his desk. And he talks about how when he got his office and he put in this big desk and he imagines out this captain of Stephen King Incorporated turning out great novels. And he said, basically, I was drunk or high and sat at that desk for years piloting a ghost ship. And when I got into recovery, I pushed that desk in the corner. I let my kids start coming into my office and hanging out with me at night. It stopped being the temple of writing and just became another part of my life. And that's something that King goes on about a lot. And it's something I think really informs his later books and makes them so good, is that this idea that life is what happens to us often when we're doing something else. I feel like King as an author is always, especially in his later books, grabbing readers by the head, turning them away from the plot, away from the monster, away from this thing we're so caught up in, and saying, look at the life, look at the people. Aren't they great?
Well, you can see that leading to two things. One is some of his books are quite long, and it's because he allows his characters the space to have those observations. And the other is that those are two observations that potentially, when biography doesn't dictate art, come out of the life experience of someone who got sober and realized that if they had stayed an alcoholic and a drug addict, maybe they would not be alive, and survived an accident that would have killed many other people.
Absolutely, yeah. When the accident's so fascinating, because one of the other books we're going to talk about is the book he wrote right after the accident that I think is his real return to greatness.
Yeah, let's shift to that one. Tell us about Duma Key.
So Duma Key, he wrote a book a few years earlier called Bag of Bones that's very similar. And the plot description could fit both of them. An artist facing a midlife crisis. In the case of Duma Key, it's a guy who had painted some as a kid, became a contractor, made a lot of money, and he gets run over by a piece of construction equipment and loses his arm. He loses everything, his marriage, his wife, etc., and goes to a small town, this case Florida, in the case of Bag of Bones, Maine, and tries to rebuild his life. And he rediscovers his art. In this case, he takes up painting again, and his paintings begin to predict things in the future or in the past. They carry these prophetic images. And in following them and pursuing them and figuring out why he does this, he solves a mystery of a murder that's happened in this town many years ago, same as in Bag of Bones. But Duma Key really gets overlooked, I think. King, as he was recovering from this accident, which was brutal and a really tough one, this guy's had an accident in the book, the main character, and a lot of the pain in the book, the descriptions of pain, the descriptions of recovering from pain, all these, how it informs how you think, how you feel, your psychology, they feel very lived and very real and very unique to King's point of view. He also, this guy is an artist, this main character. And so a lot of King's thoughts about creativity and writing and generating things that seem to come to you out of nowhere are really here. And then the horror stuff works beautifully in this. It's ghosts. There's not just ghosts, but he really does a great job with them. And he has some moments of real frisson that are fantastic. I really feel like after sort of getting through a couple of books that have their ups and downs, have their pros and cons, Duma Key is where he really hits his stride again after, a few years after recovering from this horrible accident.
We're going to go back in time a couple decades to talk about a book that you really wanted to talk about. And I'm not a fan of this book, my friend, but you, for some reason, seem to love a book called The Tommyknockers, which is one of 3 books that he published in 1987. That year, he also published Misery, and he published the second in his Dark Tower series, a book called The Drawing of the Three. There's a book about aliens. It's a giant book. There's like flying Coke machines in it. It's over the top, but you think it's great.
It's the book that made me stop reading Stephen King when I was a teenager. I was just like, nope, if this is what he's writing, I'm out. And a lot of it is, the plot is essentially the Quatermass Experiment, which is a British science fiction film about ancient aliens that are buried and get unearthed. It's been done. There's a lot of recycling in this, a lot of copying. It's a book that goes on a really long time. It's a very long book. And a lot of it is concerned with flying Coke machines and laundry racks that shoot fire, killing people.
This sounds great. I don't know why I don't love this book.
It's also the last book he wrote before he got sober that first time. And so it is, going back to it for the reread, man, I was dreading it. And it is a visionary book. It is a book, like we said, about there's a UFO that's been buried. And a woman's an artist. She's a writer. And she's walking around. She stubs her toe on it for some reason. A little bit of it is sticking out of the dirt. And she begins to excavate it. And the more they excavate, the more the alien consciousnesses inside of it start influencing the people around. So all the town of this small town in Maine start digging it up, and everyone starts going nuts, and they all stop eating. They stop drinking. They stop taking care of their teeth. Are falling out. They're getting emaciated. They're basically getting some kind of radiation, supernatural radiation poisoning, and they're becoming manic. And they're retreating to their basements and their garages and making these bizarre contraptions, like a Coke machine that flies and kills people, a laundry rack that shoots fire. And they're fiddling and tinkering and making these things and working obsessively. And when the main character comes in and to visit his friend, the writer who discovered it, he sees that she's just writing book after book after book after book. And she's gone nuts. And everyone's dying. And it's this almost shamanic vision of America, where everyone in small towns are wasting away and obsessively building things and making things and tinkering with things, useless things, stupid things. It's a book that's obsessed with free energy. Everyone in this town is suddenly energized, and their machines are powered by this UFO that no one can understand where this energy is coming from. It's a book that's obsessed with nuclear radiation. Runs through it as a side plot. And it's like King looked out on rural America and saw it getting hollowed out, and the people becoming cagier and more paranoid and suspicious of their neighbors and retreating into their houses. And it's a really startling and horrifying vision of just a country of everyone withdrawing into madness and wasting away. It's not a perfect book. I would hesitate to even say it's a good book, but on a certain psychedelic visionary level, it is a great book. King disagrees. He doesn't like it very much. He says it's not very good. So not only in this podcast have I called King a liar about Cujo, I am now going to say he doesn't even know which of his books are good and which are bad. I am horrible. I apologize to everyone.
There's a 0% chance that he is going to listen to this, so I think we're okay. I think you're okay specifically. So this is an author who's written several dozen books at this point. He's closer to 100 books than not. Are there any others that are your own sort of personal favorites? You reread a bunch. You stopped before a book called The Outsider, which I think is fantastic.
People love it. I need to.
What else would you recommend to our listeners that they read other than the big ones that they probably already have?
Yeah, so if you're curious about Stephen King and would like a gentle introduction, I strongly suggest going to different seasons and reading one of his novellas. I would skip Apt Pupil, but the Shawshank, Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption, The Body, which Stand By Me is based on, and The Breathing Method are all fantastic novellas. Also, he did Full Dark, No Stars, which is 4 novellas that are also really quite good. Also, The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon is a short book. It'll let you know if you're buying what he's selling.
I have a lot of friends with kids, who are starting to hit their early teens, and they ask, if I was to give my kid a Stephen King book, what should I give them? And I go a little too hard. Give them It or Salem's Lot, which I know you're not a fan of. But I think The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon probably is something that is YA adjacent, probably is a good entry point.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it would be marketed as a YA book if King's name wasn't on the cover, I think. It's about a kid. It's an 11-year-old kid lost in the woods. I think she's 11. And she has some hallucinations, and there's the horror of, I might starve to death and things like that. But there's no really horror element beyond that. Also, Salem's Lot's a good book. Going back to it from how much I loved it as a kid, rereading as an adult, I saw a lot of the warts that I just didn't notice when I was a kid.
Yeah.
The Shining, I always think, is sort of like the big heady rush of that full Stephen King experience.
Last question. When the hell are you going to read the Dark Tower books? How are you even on this podcast if you haven't read any of those? It
blows my mind that there are people who've only read the Dark Tower books, and that is Stephen King to them. He is a fantasy author, and they love them. So, yeah, I'm a contrarian, but I need to.
Okay.
Yeah, I will. I promise.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm going to. Not tomorrow.
Grady Hendrix, thank you so much for coming on the Book Review Podcast.
Oh, man, thanks for having me. This is a blast.
Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. This is a bit of a supersized episode, so I'm now joined by Damon Lindelof. He does many things in Hollywood, but he's most well known for being a writer and a showrunner on some of the great sci-fi and genre TV shows of this century, most notably Lost for ABC and The Leftovers and Watchmen for HBO. The reason Damon is here, of course, is because he's a Stephen King superfan. And when I conceived this episode, his name was one of the first that came to mind. So, Damon, thank you for joining the Book Review Podcast.
It's a genuine honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you. I love talking about Stephen King because for most of us, we only read Stephen King books, and that makes us feel like we're worthy of the book review.
So since you only read Stephen King books exclusively, go back to the first that you remember reading.
I was born in 1973, and my dad was a huge sci-fi, supernatural, fantasy, genre, and horror fan. So he had in his study, which was the attic of my house growing up in New Jersey, what I called the library, just shelves and shelves of these books with really provocative and interesting and sometimes terrifying covers. And my first memory of a Stephen King book, it had to be Pet Sematary, which I felt very proud of myself for pointing out was misspelled on the, as it would turn out, quite intentionally so. But, and on the cover of that book, and again, this is all my memory, I obviously could have gone on the internet and confirmed this, was like a very kind of like scary looking cat. And we had cats in our house that I had positive relations with, but this cat was terrifying. And also the title, the font of the title was like quite frightening to me. And I asked my dad if I could read it. And I want to say that I was around 9 or 10. And he said, that book is way too scary. It will terrify you, but here's another book you can read. And he gave me Firestarter, which was my Stephen King starter. He said, this is the least scary of Stephen King's books, but I think you'll like it. And so Firestarter was the first Stephen King book that I read around age 10. And I absolutely adored it. And as soon as I was finished with it, read it again, cover to cover. I think largely because its protagonist was around my age. And also this sort of idea of supernatural psychics, government conspiracies, and real like thrills. Like I felt like it was like my first grown-up book. That was my entryway into Stephen King. And then the second book, I said, I want now I want to read Pet Sematary. And my dad said, still too scary. Then he gave me Salem's Lot. He was like, this is a good gateway into the scary stuff. And I loved Salem's Lot even more than I loved Firestarter because it was pretty frightening, but manageably so. And then after Salem's Lot, I think I finally was allowed to read Pet Sematary, and then I read Carrie.
I now live in a house in New Jersey, and my attic is my study, and it's full of shelves upon shelves of Stephen King books and sci-fi books and stuff like that. So maybe my son, who is now 9, has something to look forward to.
Oh my God. Wow. The circle continues. My son, who is now 17, has no interest. He loves nonfiction. So he is not interested in horror, genre, supernatural, sci-fi, any of those things, despite all of my best efforts to convert him. So you're going to have to carry the torch for us, Gilbert.
Now, I've mentioned some of the shows that you've worked on. I've seen Lost, which was a show that ran for many seasons on ABC, and which I think many people have seen. I've seen it all the way through twice. And I remember quite well the season 3 opener, which is where we first meet Juliet, the character Juliet. And I actually cannot hear Petula Clark's song Downtown without thinking of that episode, which is a very weird thing to me, but that is the truth of the matter. But one of the other things that happens in that episode is that we see this character Juliet leading a book club discussion, and they're talking about the book Carrie. And one guy who's clearly coded as the jerk of the group says, it's not even literature, it's popcorn. And I'm curious how you chose to include that book in that episode, but also more broadly, how did King's work play out in terms of influence on that show, on the writer's room, on you and your co-showrunner, Carlton Cuse?
I think that it was very clear to all of us from the very first conversation that I had with JJ as we were conceiving the show that Stephen King was a huge influence. And one of the ways that writers talk to one another is that we build like a common vernacular around our influences. So that if I were a musician, I think the way that I would talk to other musicians is, who do you listen to? Who did you listen to as a kid? Who are you into? What are the bands that basically are like the progenitors of your sound and your style? Because everything is foundational. And I think in writing, particularly in pop culture writing, very often you're dealing directly with other people's intellectual property, that takes all the romance out of it when you call it IP. But I think that if you're adapting The Stand, then it's very clear that Stephen King was an influence. But we started talking about The Stand very early on as it related to Lost for a couple of reasons. The first was that our approach to it was going to be heavily ensembleized. And that is to say that The Stand doesn't have a traditional main character in the way that most books and movies do. It had many characters, both good guys and bad guys, and some sort of vacillating in between the two poles. But I think that the idea that there was both a pragmatic reality to it, that is to say a super flu that wipes out a large predominant portion of the population, that's a real thing that could happen. And then there was a supernatural edge to it, which is that the survivors kind of start having these dreams invariably about a very scary guy who is taking up residence in Las Vegas, or this sort of calming, wonderful woman who is, I think, in Nebraska in the beginning, but ultimately compelling everybody to move to Boulder, Colorado. Because good people live in Boulder and bad people live in Vegas. We know this to be true.
That's the way it's always been.
And the way it shall always be. Anyway, and so that idea of trying to answer questions about whether the show was real or fantastical, we always migrated back to The Stand. And the other writer that we would reference, particularly with ABC, who did not want the show to be weird or supernatural at all, was Michael Crichton. Mm-hmm. Because for some reason, ABC felt like Jurassic Park was not genre because, they get the dinosaur DNA from mosquitoes. So we lied to them and told them that we were doing Crichton, but we were actually doing Stephen King. And therefore, he became part of the language of the show. And certainly when Carlton came on about midway through season 1, he was also a huge Stephen King fan. And then somewhere, I think in the first season, Stephen King was writing a column for Entertainment Weekly, and he like shouted out Lost as a show that he liked. And I can't understate how exciting that was. I think that, and this is not me rewriting history, but in addition to the fact that the show was a ratings hit and was getting some degree of critical love and was on magazine covers and had just broken through in a way that nobody expected it to. I think that our hope was that it would be like Twin Peaks, like a cult phenomenon that would be quickly canceled and remembered fondly, not what it became. But when it was on Stephen King's radar, and he wasn't saying this is a huge ripoff of my stuff, but more something that I'm into, I just went absolutely and totally berserk with joy. So the whole book club was a bit of an open acknowledgement for for everyone to know how we felt about him and what an influence he was, and to break the meta veil of there were often characters reading books on Lost, and we wanted to make sure that we were very specific in our selection of those books. And so in addition to kind of Dickens, I can't imagine another single author having more of an influence on the creative of Lost than Stephen King. So we had to shout it out.
I happened to be working as just a minor editorial assistant at Entertainment Weekly in the mid-2000s. And I remember there might be different occasions because you spoke to him, I believe, later on when you were doing The Leftovers, I think. But you and Carlton Cuse and J.J. Abrams, who you mentioned before, all went up to Maine one time to meet Stephen King. And I wouldn't ask this if I didn't want you to indulge in some respectful fanboy sort of reminiscence about that occasion.
It was one of the best kind of 24-hour periods in my life. Again, I think that there's this like popular belief that you never meet your idols because they will disappoint you. And I think that if you set the bar too high, how can they not disappoint you? Because they're real people. So I was very nervous about meeting Stephen King, but at the same time, I had heard him speak on a number of occasions, had read everything that he'd written, including On Writing, which is like his most personal, kind of like autobiographical, that and Danse Macabre. Oh, this is who I am. And so I had a sense of the guy, but you never know what it's going to be like when you're in a room with them. And so in addition to Carlton and JJ and myself, Jeff Jensen, who had basically been covering Lost and almost written himself into the fabric of Lost as its sort of like chief theorizer, we all, and also a huge Stephen King fan, we all went out together to Bangor or Bangor. I don't know what the appropriate pronunciation is. And we drove out to this very unassuming office like that you would drive by. It felt like it was just like a little strip mall. And it was just one office and a single assistant who was lovely and welcomed us in. And there was Stephen King sitting behind the desk. And we proceeded to, I felt very nervous. And he immediately eased and calmed all of us, welcomed us as equals, even though it felt like the ground was quite slanted in terms of the way that we looked up to him. And engaged us in this conversation about the show, about creativity, about writing. And before we knew it, 2 hours had gone by. And then he said, do you guys want to come to my house? And we just thought that all that was on the schedule was for us to just do this interview that Jeff was going to basically cover. So now we were off the clock, and Stephen brought us to his house. And talk about a library. He brought us down into the, I think one of the lower levels of his house, where he's as I'm sure, not just a voracious writer, but also a voracious reader, and saw his collection. And then just hung out there for a couple of hours. And then he said, are you guys hungry? Do you want some really good lobster rolls? So we were like, yeah, we want to have dinner with Steve King. Now, I may be misremembering this detail. One part I'm sure of, the other part I'm not sure of, but I think he was driving driving an old Pontiac Firebird. That is to say, it was like an early 1980s two-seater car. So every time we went from one location to another one of us got to ride shotgun with Steve. And so from the office to his house, JJ went with him. And then from his house to Lobster Rolls, Carlton went with him. And I was like, I'm not going to get to drive with Steve. But then as we were eating dinner, Steve was like, hey, do you guys want to go see a scary movie? I saw a really good scary movie. It was called The Descent.
Great movie.
Fantastic movie. And we're like, yes, we want to see a scary movie with Stephen King. So I got to ride with Steve from Lobster Rolls to The Descent. And the one detail that I will share is we were driving. I feel like it's inappropriate to talk about what he and I discussed, other than to say, I'll always remember it. It is incredible. But what I can share is that down by my feet, because I was riding in shotgun, there was like a trash, like garbage, just like there is in my car, any single man's car. Well, neither of us were single at the time. But anyway, this was the car that I feel like Steve drives when he's not driving other people around. And I looked down and there were all these scratchers, like lottery tickets. And I sort of picked one up and it was scratched off. And I said, are these yours? Do you play the lottery? And he goes, you never know when you're going to get lucky. And that is why I love Stephen King. And may he win all the scratchers in the world. But then we went to go see The Descent. And if your question is, does Stephen King talk to the screen? The answer is yes, even though he'd already seen the movie once. So I feel like you know how there's like a Criterion streamer? Mm-hmm. If there was a Stephen King streamer where it was just Stephen King talking to movies, I would literally pay tens of thousands of dollars a month to get that experience again. It was quite wonderful. And then The Descent ended and we all stood in the parking lot and chatted for another 10 or 15 minutes. And then we went back to our hotel and flew back the next day. But I will say this is probably the most important part of all of it, which is that Steve wrote a column for Entertainment Weekly about Lost, saying that he loved the show, but that it had to end. And the reason was that when he was a kid, he watched the show called Wagon Train. And he grew frustrated with it because he knew that the wagon train could never make it to the West Coast, because then the show would be over. They were just going to keep on wagon training, as he said. And I had already been lobbying quite aggressively for an end date for Lost, and had been told by everyone, even allies like JJ and Carlton and my wife and my agents, who were like, yes, I understand, but they're never going to let you do it because the show is far too popular. I think Steve writing that column and openly advocating for there to be an end for the show was really pivotal in ultimately convincing ABC to allow us to do so. And that was about midway through the third season that they finally caved and said, okay, we'll let you end the show. And I do feel like in a galaxy where Stephen King does not exist, not only doesn't Lost exist because he was such an inspiration for it, but also the fact that we were able to end the show, I think that he was directly responsible for as well.
I know that you are a fan of the Dark Tower books. We had a guest on that will appear in the segment before this, a novelist, a horror novelist. His name is Grady Hendrix. And actually, if you're interested in 70s and 80s paperbacks, he's a novelist, but he also did this amazing compendium of 70s and 80s paperback horror covers from period called Paperbacks from Hell. It'd be a great gift for someone to get you or for you to get yourself. You should check it out. But he has read and reread many of Stephen King's books, but he has not read the Dark Tower series. And so I know you're a big fan of them, as am I. I wanted you to sort of come on and talk about why you think they're so appealing to those listeners who have never read these books. It's a series of 7 books. There's another one that came out after the series proper ended. And it imagines this world in which there's a gunslinger. The first book is called The Gunslinger, who has been chasing a man across the desert for years and years and years and years. And it starts in this very small way, and it grows to include not only the gunslinger trying to prevent the collapse of his world, but possibly the collapse of all interconnected worlds, including the Earth that we live on.
What an interesting blind spot for a Stephen King fan to have.
He is very aware of this.
But I also completely and totally understand it, because I feel like it was very clear from the jump that the Dark Tower books were going to be different than everything else that Stephen King was doing, largely because they were serialized. From the jump, the first book, The Gunslinger, which is not called Dark Tower the Gunslinger, it's just called The Gunslinger. He said this is a part of a series, unlike anything that he had done before, and that he was going to write the series over a period of years and didn't know how long it was going to take him to do so. But I think certainly by the time Drawing of the Three came out, which was the second book in the Dark Tower saga, he explicitly said, I think it's going to be 7 books. And so I think that this idea that the books that he was writing as huge pop cultural phenomena, bestsellers, everybody knows Firestarter, everybody knows Pet Sematary, everybody knows The Shining. The Gunslinger books were sort of like Mick Jagger saying, this is not my Rolling Stones stuff. This is my solo stuff. And so it's going to sound like Mick Jagger, but it's also different than the Rolling Stones. I do feel like The Gunslinger has horror elements, but it's much different than anything else that Stephen King was writing. And it wasn't really designed to be mass market, because if my memory serves, certainly this was the case with the Gunslinger and the Drawing of the Three, is they were limited editions.
Mm-hmm.
So you had to, my dad was like part of some Stephen King fan club, and that's how he got a copy of the Gunslinger. And this was obviously well before any semblance of the internet existed. So the only way to know that the Gunslinger was a thing, and more importantly, the only way to buy the Gunslinger, was to be part of this sort of like super uber Stephen King fan community. And so there was this feeling of, here's this guy who's become massively popular, but he's playing a show like at a small bar down the street, and only I know about it. So that's what's happening at the upper level of why these books held like a special kind of power, which is that there was an exclusivity. This is for the true fans. But then the other part was that they're just phenomenal pieces of writing. And the richness and the density of the world building. All of Stephen King's books take place in a heightened version of the world that we are familiar with. So Carrie, Firestarter, The Shining, Pet Sematary, they're all like characters discovering, oh, wow, there's psychic phenomena. Oh, wow, if I bury a dead body in this weird graveyard out in the woods, they'll come back to life. And it isn't until the Drawing of the Three where the Gunslinger starts to portal into our world in different time periods, but I think largely kind of the 1970s and 80s, that you begin to understand the correlation between the two. And then as the series goes on, the Gunslinger begins to weave in characters from other King novels and even some Bachman books. And it just becomes this massive kind of multiplayer game that I don't want to spoil anything about it, but there's the Dark Tower books before his accident, before Steve got hit by the van, and then the books that follow that literally process that accident on both a meta level and a plot level. I've never seen anything like it before or since in popular fiction, that has to be read to be truly appreciated.
I mean, two of the things that have always appealed to me about those books is, one, the sort of how they cross genres without really having any regard for the fact that maybe they normally wouldn't cross, right? It's he's a horror writer, but these are books that incorporate horror, westerns, fantasy, science fiction. It's all of those sort of major genres that really operate in their own spheres are thrown together in this way in these books. And then the other one is,
I think the kids call that a mashup.
That's a mashup. Do we still say mashup?
Now we call it a mashup, and therefore it's not cool anymore.
All
but
right,
yes.
Yeah. And then it's a series that, as you say, really brought his universe, which wasn't a universe other than there are these towns in Maine that are next to each other, together in a way that presages what we see now in popular culture, which is this idea of a shared universe.
Yeah, the SKU, as it were. And again, there's nothing more exhilarating for me to see Father Callahan show up in the Dark Tower series, having basically like 15 years after I read Salem's Lot for the first time. And this is not annotated. You have to know. It's just this when you read something in the Dark Tower series and you have this odd sense of deja vu. Where do I know that name from? And in a pre-internet age, again, all you could do was basically go to the library and thumb through the books and say, was this a character in The Regulators? Like what? What? Like how deep of a dive are we doing here?
As you rightly pointed out, I feel like we could talk about the Dark Tower forever on its own podcast, but I do want to ask you as we sort of exit here, what your favorite King book is. You talked about the ones you read at the beginning, talked about this long series, but what's your favorite?
I'm not going to do that thing that parents do when I have an only child, so it's easy for me. But parents are like, I love them all in different ways. And then you ask the kids, by the way, and they're like, oh, that one is dad's favorite. So the kids know. I love a lot of Stephen King's books, and I've probably read The Stand, particularly the unabridged Stand, the most times. And I think that it is probably the most influential book in terms of my writing and my storytelling. And the thing that I really do believe has always elevated him beyond a pop culture novelist to someone who is really writing literature and perfected a certain kind of form of storytelling. But my favorite one, the one that I love the most, is actually a Bachman book, and it's called The Long Walk.
Tell us briefly, for those listeners who haven't read it, what it's about.
The Long Walk, not unlike The Running Man, but in an entirely different universe than The Running Man, is basically, it takes place in a not too distant, totalitarian, authoritarian, sort of slightly Orwellian future, where every single year there is a game show, for lack of or a competition called The Long Walk. And they have a lottery, and it's all boys. 100 boys are basically, I think maybe they're representative of their states or whatever, but it starts in Maine and it goes down the Eastern Seaboard, and it's nationally televised, and it's like the Super Bowl of Super Bowls. And essentially the way that it works is the kids start walking, and they're all around 18 or 19. And if you slow down beyond 4 miles an hour, that you get a warning. And if you get 3 warnings, they shoot you. And so if you stop walking, they shoot you. And so you have to keep walking and walking. You can eat while you're walking. You can go to the restroom while you're walking. And I think that if you get a warning, which they call a ticket, if you get a ticket, you have to walk for an hour or two to erase the ticket. So you can erase your warnings. And you're not allowed to sleep. You're not allowed to rest. You're not allowed to take breaks. You just walk. And basically the last one standing, they shoot 99 of the contestants. The last one standing wins. And whatever they win like a wish. That whatever they wish has to basically be granted within the grandiose scheme of things that are possible. Like they can't wish to fly. But basically like anything that the authoritarian government is in a position to give them, they will give them. And so that's the premise. And this is decades before the Hunger Games, which I also love. But the way that it's written, the brutality of it, it doesn't have any supernatural aspect to it like the Bachman books, with the exception of Thinner. There's no sort of like hint of powers or magic or psychic phenomena. It's just hardcore, straight up, brutal violence, and yet profound and beautiful and sad and weird and deeply upsetting. But that's my favorite.
That is a great choice. I think it was him, if I'm recalling correctly, one way in which he was trying to metaphorize Vietnam, the draft system of Vietnam, as someone who, as a young man, had to deal with that. He didn't end up going to Vietnam, but it is a precursor to Hunger Games, Battle Royale, sort of stuff like that. It's a great pick. I, too, am surprised that it has not been adapted into something, although I feel like there have been I've read in the trades a couple of attempts, but it has all been for naught. It's a great pick, Damon, and this was a great conversation. I am so glad you're able to make time to come on. This is such a delight. Thank you for talking all things King.
It was an honor and a pleasure. And I just want to mention one last thing because it's very relevant to this conversation, which is that The Leftovers, which was my follow-up to Lost, the next show that I worked on. When Lost ended, I was like, I'm never doing another television show for all sorts of reasons we could talk about in another podcast. But I always read the Sunday New York Times book review. every Sunday, never miss it. And Stephen King wrote a review of The Leftovers. And his review basically said it was the greatest episode of The Twilight Zone that had never aired. And as someone who loves Parada's writing, I was like, Tom Parada wrote a fantasy novel that Stephen King is praising in the New York Times Book Review. I have to check this out. And then that was basically the next 5 years of my life. So again, Steve.
That's an incredible story. I love The Leftovers. I'm glad he's had such an influence on you because those two shows are two favorites of mine. Real delight to have you on, Damon. Thank you for making the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Those were my conversations with novelist Grady Hendrix and the TV showrunner Damon Lindelof on 50 Years of Stephen King. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.